But ultimately, she gaslit, she gatekept, and she girl bossed. And damn did she eat that man's eyeballs. Welcome to an episode of Cook a Book where I cook very badly while I talk about books. Women truly were not meant to be in the kitchen, at least not me. However, I have been craving spicy dumpling soup lately, and so I am putting myself to the task of making it for the first time. So I'm going to show you the ingredients that I got from a Korean supermarket. I'm actually not sure how spicy it's going to be because the grocery store that I went to had very limited options when it came to soup base. Most of the soup base that I saw in the store was for hot pot, and I was told that I shouldn't use hot pot base for soup because it's too salty. So I went with Korean style army stew instead, but I realize now that it still says hot pot soup base. So I don't know if I'm just totally off market with that, but we are gonna try this out. I'm also trying some Taiwanese noodles that I got. Gotta have veggies, so we have snow white mushrooms. And then for the protein, we have pork, Chinese celery, and shrimp dumplings, and some eggs that are technically expired a month ago. But fun fact, you can test if eggs are still good to use or not by putting them in a cup of water, and if the egg stays at the bottom of the cup of water, that means it's still good to go. Don't I sound like I know what I'm doing in the kitchen just by sharing this fun fact with you guys? Well, that's gonna be the extent of it. I've never tried to make something like this before, but we are gonna see how it goes. I mean, I figured if it turns out really badly, that will at least be entertaining for people who are watching this video. At the same time, I'll also be talking about 10 books that I have read recently. So if I sound coherent at all to you, please appreciate my skill at multitasking. A lot of you like to watch these videos because not only are you entertained by my incompetence, but you also get some interesting books on the side to check out. Beyond the 10 books I'm going to be talking about, another great way to find new books to read is through Book of the Month, which is the sponsor of today's video. Book of the Month's mission is to bring the best new fiction forward. So every month they go through hundreds of book titles and carefully choose what they believe to be the best new fiction, and then you get to decide which books get to be delivered to your door. I really appreciate that they focus on new and emerging authors because that way I get to discover books that I wouldn't have known about before. So the books that I chose for this month include The Dagger and the Flame, which is a young adult romantasy. Even the back cover is really stunning. And then the other book that I chose was Sally Rooney's new book, just because obviously she's a very buzzy author. I want to see if she can keep up with all the work that she's done. But there are still plenty more books to choose from. Best of all, Book of the Month has the best new prices for new release hardcover fiction, plus free shipping and a loyalty rewards program. So if you want to try it out, you can get your first box for only $5 using the code PUMPKIN. So thanks again to Book of the Month for sponsoring, and now let's get back to the video. So first thing that I'm going to do is boil water to put the dumplings in. And while we wait for the water to boil, I'll talk about the first book that I read. It's actually coming out soon on October 15. It's called Sorcery and Small Magics. This is a cozy fantasy. It's slow burn and it's gay. I wouldn't say that it's as cozy as Emily Wilde is, but that's a pretty hard bar to beat. However, if you're sick of the straights and you want to see the gays instead, then you might be interested in this book. Basically, there's two main characters you follow. One of them is this sorcerer who is completely unserious. And of course, as many unserious characters are, we find that he just uses his lightheartedness as a coping mechanism to hide the true angsty feelings. Not that I would know, of course. Despite being a sorcerer, he refuses to touch anything regarding powerful magic. So a lot of the stuff that he does is just like very small stuff, like changing the color of your hair to pink or something ridiculous like that. So he's not really taken seriously by his peers, and especially not his other peer, who is a much more talented and serious and grumpy sorcerer. Basically the polar opposite, and very renowned for his skill in powerful magic. And the two of them obviously can't stand each other. They do their best to stay the fuck away from one another, but as circumstances would have it, they accidentally become magically bound to one another because of a mistake that the goofy guy makes. And as a result, the two of them have to learn to work together, and they go on a journey through this dangerous area of the land to find a cure for the forbidden magic that is forcing them to be together. So it follows a lot of tropes that I think a lot of people would like forced proximity, rivals to lovers. It's got a unique magic system as well. Again, I do think the cozy fantasy is less Emily Wilde and more like Nettle and Bone, which I read earlier this year, just because it's low stakes. You follow the characters on a journey. There are endearing side characters that also help the protagonist on their quest along the way. The characters do feel some intense things due to their past, but for the most part, the stakes aren't like the end of the world. It's more personal issues that they're dealing with. It's very character driven and also very slow burn romance. Obviously, the biggest strength of the book are the main characters. Part of me did kind of wish that the side characters had more development though, because they are part of the quest that you go along with them. So they did feel a little bit underdeveloped, but I also am willing to give grace because there's going to be more than one book, and I do think you follow other characters. So I do think that's going to be an opportunity for them to be more fleshed out. The next 2 books that I read were nonfiction books about living with disabilities. So the first one that I had read was called Against Technoableism. This is basically a manifesto about the ways that disabled people are not considered in society, including the technology that we develop that theoretically is supposed to alleviate the problems that disabled people face, but come with their own discrimination and biases. And her argument is that a lot of disabled people don't want the things that able people expect that they want. Especially when it comes to technology, there is a lot of harmful belief that technology is a solution for disability and that disabled people are just waiting around hoping to get fixed by whatever technology gets developed. And instead, what we should be prioritizing is making society more accessible and equitable to disabled people in the first place. The book is basically an introduction for various topics related to what I just said, like mobility devices, medical infrastructure, neurodivergence. Ooh, I get so scared when I put stuff in a boiling pot of water. But a point that she makes that I'm realizing with every book I read about disability is that you will be disabled regardless. This is going to happen in our future because the climate is fucked and we can't escape aging. So rather than trying to put a band-aid on this issue and seeing disabilities as liabilities, why don't we actually view disability technology as skill sets that enable you to navigate a world that is already challenging itself? Like, why does it have to be put on the individual instead of the actual systemic issue that's going on? I personally would have wanted the book to go more in depth because it was really more like introductory level, but maybe that's like what it was going for. It was very short and concise. The chapters could be read in any order as well, so you can really jump in anywhere that you want. I read it on audiobook and it was only 4 hours. So again, very short and sweet. Next nonfiction book that I read after that was Disability Intimacy. This is an anthology that was compiled by the same author as Disability Visibility, which I talked about in my previous book wrap up, and I really enjoyed that one. Oh my god, it's spoiling so much. Am I doing it right? Okay, I'm just gonna lower it. The essays in this book are focused on intimacy within the disabled community, and that could mean a lot of things. It could mean the intimacy with your caregiver or with your community or with the friends and family that you have. I personally liked Disability Visibility better. I don't know if it's just because the intimacy definition was a little bit too broad for me that it kind of became less focused as I would like. I also think that in this particular collection, there were a lot more weaker essays compared to the first anthology. I think I just wanted more cohesion and consistent quality of essays. After that, the next book that I read is Dear Wendy. This is a young adult book that focuses on 2 main characters who are both asexual and aromantic. Both of them start an Instagram account where they pose as anonymous people who are giving advice to submit questions to them on their Instagram accounts. And because they both have very similar types of accounts, they end up having an online feud with each other. But when they meet each other in real life, they become friends, not knowing about their secret online identities. This was definitely a lighter book to read because the stakes are not very high. And even when they inevitably find out the truth about each other, it's not like a deep betrayal or anything like that. So it's a very chill book to read. And I found it really sweet because I haven't really read many books that feature ace characters. So it helped to make me think about the ways that society really revolves around couples. And so much, oh my god, The boiling water hit me. This is why I cannot be a chef in the kitchen, because I am too much of a pussy when it comes to anything splashing on me. But anyway, I feel like a lot of the ways that people imagine the future, it always comes with the requirement of being in a couple. When the characters were talking about how lonely that feels, it made me realize something that I hadn't considered before, because I'm not ace, and I like the discussions of alternate ways of living that prioritize friendships, because romance does not have to be the center of the whole fucking world. And I like how it emphasizes that friendships can be just as intimate and loving as romantic relationships are. And I totally vibe with that message, because I always thought that living in a commune with a bunch of your friends nearby is the ideal life to be. I'm tired of the suburban life bullshit where everyone is just scattered far away from each other. That's why I moved away from California, because even though all my friends lived in California, it was a whole ordeal to even schedule when we could see each other, because it's like several hours of driving or taking a flight. But the way that our infrastructure and society is set up does not allow for that. Like, you're expected to just settle down with a person in your same house, and you barely get to see anybody else in your life unless you make considerable effort to do so. And even then, that's like a whole ordeal. So something to be aware of before you get into this book. I feel like if you are someone who doesn't really like reading constant pop culture references in your book, especially when it comes to like Taylor Swift or like Tumblr jokes and stuff like that, you probably wouldn't really be into the writing. I personally didn't mind it, but I can see other people maybe not being into that. I think that's pretty realistic for like college age students though. Also, maybe I'm just a sensitive bitch, but I kind of feel like when they were online and posting digs at each other, sometimes I really felt like they were so mean. I would be listening to the audiobook and then they would say some really mean-spirited stuff and I'd be like, oh my gosh. The way my feelings would get so hurt if some of these people said the same things to me, that I don't know if I could be friends with them as easily as these two ended up being. But hey, maybe they're like soulmates for each other and they're able to have thicker skin and roll with the punches like that. I just think about if there was someone on the internet that was saying really mean shit about me, could I be friends with them in real life that easily? I don't know. But hey, where's that for them? So I'm glad for that. Next book that I read is Your Driver is Waiting. This follows a rideshare driver who is just scraping by through life because she's got a lot of shit going on. She's dealing with her dad passing away, her mom needing constant care and looking after her. And in general, being a rideshare driver sucks because you know they're getting paid pennies. The inciting incident of the book is when she meets and falls for a passenger. The person she falls for is a rich white woman. And for context, the main character is a queer, brown, poor girl. So even though they come from very different worlds, she falls very hard and fast for the rich white girlie. But you can see how it gets tense because in scenes where the rich white girl meets the main character's friends, you can really tell that the girl is kind of out of touch to the point where it gives me secondhand embarrassment to read. Like, she really is a caricature of a privileged girl who doesn't understand that poor brown people face problems and you probably shouldn't call the cops on someone if they're acting in a way that you don't approve of. The backdrop of the story is also politically tense because throughout the story, when you're following the main character drive around the city, there's a lot of rallies and protests going on in the background. She doesn't participate in any of them. She kind of just passes them by. So I guess the main commentary that the author does is really just between her dynamic with this girl that she's falling for. As I'm reading it, I'm like, girl, you can't be this down bad for someone who is so obnoxious and stupid. Like, I don't care how good the cooch is. If she embarrasses you around your friends, that is a red flag. But I feel like the main character was just so blinded by lust for this girl. I don't know why. Part of me is like, girl, you need to love yourself. When I started the book, I was very open to enjoying it because the main character seemed like a cool bitch. She was constantly talking about her biceps and how hot and muscular her body was. And I was like, okay, go you butch queen. But it was hard for me to see the appeal of the girl that she was falling so hard for. I didn't quite understand why her, of all people. Like, I get that sexual chemistry is a thing, but it was hard for me to truly feel that from the text. Like, I don't mind reading characters who are acting like a dumb bitch because same, but I gotta believe it, you know? And I just didn't really believe it for this particular book. And it's a shame because I feel like the protagonist really could have been easily charismatic and strong and queer and funny. And it was really just sidetracked by this weird lust an obsession that she has for the other girl, to the point where like describing it was almost cartoonish. It was like sunshine and rainbows when it was clearly not. Again, I know that's how people delude themselves into thinking, but it was hard for me to buy into that for the book. Now let's see if the soup base is gonna be a miss for me as well. After that, the next book that I read is The Age of Magical Overthinking. This unfortunately was also a miss, but I had read the author's other books before. Basically, she is a linguist. I think her books are very accessible and easy to read. The one that I particularly liked the most that I read previously from her was about cultish behavior and the ways that we talk in cults in order to recruit people, and that was cool. So I decided to check out this book, and to me it kind of felt like just a bunch of random facts. This book felt a lot more general because it was focused on the cognitive biases that we have and the power and disadvantages and various ways that we engage in magical thinking. This term basically means the way that your internal thoughts can affect unrelated events that are happening outside of your brain. Like the idea that you can just manifest your way out of poverty, or that you can beat cancer with positive vibes, or like many of you bitches out there thinking that you can fix an unhealthy relationship if you are just loyal and loving and dedicated to one another. It's understandable why a lot of people think this way, because it's easier to believe that you have your own agency in order to fix a problem that's going on, but sometimes it gets so dialed up to the point of being irrational, just like how I am being irrational in thinking that I could properly cook this. I feel like a lot of things that the book talks about is stuff that you pretty much already know, like the sunk cost fallacy, where you stay in a relationship longer because you've already been in it for so long, or like the halo effect, where you assume that just because someone is hot and conventionally attractive that they must be a good person. All of these things we already kind of know, and even the things that like we didn't really know, I feel like you could have easily just found that out in a TikTok without dedicating your time to reading a whole ass book about it. The book was very underwhelming for me. It kind of just felt like an info dump of pop psychology facts, intro to Psych 101 stuff. There wasn't a way to really connect everything together. You could really jump in at any point, at any random chapter, and you wouldn't need to like catch up with what was going on beforehand, which again is why I feel like this could have just been summarized in TikToks instead, rather than trying to put it in some kind of cohesive book. So not only are the ideas very surface level, but it's also disjointed. There's like no attempt to try to connect it all together into some kind of thesis or have some kind of conclusion or insight from it. So overall, it was very scattered, short on research, and honestly, it kind of felt like a money grab to me, because at least the author's previous two books had like a strong thesis or connecting theme together. But this one just felt like it was pumped out really quickly to get money. And I feel like this should be a lesson that sometimes you just gotta let things cook. That was not intended to be a pun for what I'm doing right now. All right, I need to dump the dumplings in here so that I can properly, okay. Sorry you had to hear that and see that. Once again, I am a wuss in the kitchen. So, you know what? I realized that we are gonna be following a theme here, because the next book that I read was also a flop, and it's called The Courage to Be Disliked. See, I picked up this book not really knowing anything about it. I just saw the title and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I feel like as a person on the internet, I should get used to people disliking me. What I found out is that it was actually a philosophy book. This follows the theories of a professor named Alfred Adler, where the belief is that we are all free to determine our own future regardless of past experiences and trauma and doubts and expectations and whatnot. It is a philosophy that is supposed to be very liberating, in the sense that like you give yourself more ownership over your life and agency over the decisions that you make. Damn, now that I look at my stew, I realize I probably should have bought way more leafy vegetables, because there is absolutely no color in the stew at all. No greens whatsoever. But anyway, the book is kind of set up weirdly, because rather than telling you the information straightforwardly, it frames the information as this fictional conversation between a philosopher and a young man who is very argumentative, doesn't believe in what the philosopher is saying because he's like, what do you mean that we can overcome our trauma and that we're just making it up in our heads? That's not right. And I like that we have a young dude that can be a representation of my skepticism when reading this book. But again, because this is a fictional conversation set up by the author, we constantly see in the dialogue that the philosopher is able to make this young guy open his eyes to why he is correct about his philosophy on life and that trauma doesn't exist and that we can overcome it. And so there's like these moments of kind of like a gotcha where the young guy is one-upped by what the philosopher is saying and eventually he's able to come around to it. But it's like, yeah, of course you're able to make all these insightful moments of the young guy being proven wrong because you're literally just making up this random ass dialogue that never happened. This book was really famous in Japan and I don't know why because the philosophy wasn't even specific to the East. I personally don't think this book should be followed in any country because some of the teachings are about how trauma doesn't exist, people choose to be unhappy, and all this other kind of bullshit that completely dismisses the reality of mental illnesses and how some people genuinely cannot help it. I think the language of being able to magically snap your finger and get out of the trauma or depression that you're going through is such a simplification of the way that the brain actually works. And overall, I did not find the book to be deep. I actually found a lot of the teachings to be almost like surface level pop psychology. The worst part of it is that this encourages victim blaming and uses very common rhetoric that society uses to justify things that are messed up in the world. Because it's like, if you say that you can just simply overcome depression and that trauma isn't a real thing, that's gonna take away the very real need for people to have mental health care. It's gonna continue this false idea that we live in a meritocracy. And theoretically, sure, if you had a normal skill set of self-regulation and you were born with a nervous system that could handle trauma and be able to get through that, yeah, of course this advice makes sense, but not everyone has those things. And so to make these very broad general statements, it's just simply not true. And I can't take you seriously if you're saying shit like that. But fortunately, in the next book, I finally read a story that calls out societal bullshit because the next book that I read is The Last Witch in Edinburgh. This is a historical novel about a woman who, in the beginning of the book, starts off living in the 1800s. And during that time, it was pretty shitty for women, especially if you were accused of being a witch. And that could be for all kinds of things, like if you write with your left hand. I'm already fucked in that department. Or if you just wandered around after dark, or I don't know, you just pissed the man off, then they're like, witch! And then you get hung for it. And that's just a lovely example of what it's like to be a woman. So the main character actually ends up meeting this apothecary that is a front for being a coven of witches, which in the beginning is kind of like sketch for her because she knows her ass could be hung right away, but she comes to find that these women are actually chill as hell. And this is why female friendship and a community of women that decenter men is so important, because as a result, she's able to kind of have more confidence in herself, find more fulfillment in doing things that help society, like helping other women. She also meets this girl that's in the apothecary that she falls for. So they are two bisexual bitches, nay, witches, that fall for each other. Unfortunately, this coven has this ancient enemy that is trying to hunt down all these witches and leave a bunch of violence and destruction. And of course, it is all... Oh my god. I'm realizing now that the fact that I decided to make stew is very, very dangerous for me because I am afraid of boiling water. Just like the witches are. Wow, I really couldn't have timed this better. Anyway, just like my cooking, disaster strikes for these witches. The main character ends up running away and she spends the next 2 centuries hiding away from the world until she reunites with a very familiar person, and she kind of has to deal with the consequences of running away like a coward. But as long as she owns up to it and tries to defeat the bigger patriarchal power, that is what is most important. So you're really just following the main character over the course of decades. I thought it was interesting that like the first half is historical and then the second half is modern day. And you can see how the patriarchy and systemic issues that women are facing, it's like different, but basically the same, just transformed in different entities. I also appreciate that by the time you get to present day, like her and her love interest are basically old women. They're called hags. And I just love that. I love that we're owning up to being an ugly old bitch. That is where I am at in my stage of life right now. Anyway, as someone who is not very familiar with Edinburgh, hence my mispronunciation of it so many times in previous videos, I surprisingly learned a lot from it based on the author's note because yeah, it's fictional, but it draws so much inspiration from the actual 1700s in Edinburgh, where Scotland has had a history of witch trials and constant misogyny and persecution. I mean, that's pretty much bound to happen in any place historically, but it's really interesting to see the specificity in Scotland. But overall, it's really about kinship among women and reclaiming power. And something about this author that I've noticed just from my time reading her previous book, and fun fact, she's also my writing mentor, so she's like the first person that ever read my full book in its entirety. I think she and I are similar in writing main characters that are purposely passive. And so it's fun for me to read her books because I see certain elements that she uses and I'm like, oh, now I can see why you ended up liking my book. Because we like passive bitches whose first instinct is to run away instead of dealing with their problems. Because I really feel like that's how bitches be in real life. I mean, that's how I am. So it's nice to see that type of main character rather than like our narrow definition of a strong female character, and having a cast of characters that are predominantly women. I also appreciate that, and I can see why we like each other's stories. The next book that I read after that is a horror book called The Eyes Are the Best Part. This follows a main character who is a college student whose father is absent, and so as a result, one day her mother falls in love with a white man who very clearly has an Asian fetish, and so the main character and her sister are so repulsed by him. But then it gets kind of weird because she's constantly thinking about the guy's blue eyes, but not in like an endearing kind of way, more so in a way where she low-key wants to cut them out and eat them. And then as you progress through the book, it becomes less low-key and more high-key. Okay, I'm gonna show you the bowl that I made. I am not really impressed by it. I wish that I had added more greens. I'll eat it though and I'll see how it goes. I mean, I have a whole pot of it, so I'm basically stuck eating it for the next few days. I really should have added more variety in the ingredients, and I also added way too many noodles, but if I end up liking the taste of the stew, maybe I'll continue making it, but with better ingredients next time, but we shall see. Oh my god, I realized that the entire time I was filming the whole video, I did not even have my microphone attached to the camera. So if you're wondering why all of a sudden the audio for this clip is way better than the previous clip, that is why. I'm gonna test it out. I think it's all right, but I'm not like excited to make this. Like, I think I'm gonna eat it just because I made it, but would I put in the labor of making it again? I'm not sure. Oh, the mushrooms are good. Okay, so I'll keep that one. The dumplings, I'm not sure about my choice in that. My expired eggs taste good. Yeah, the soup is flavorful, so I wouldn't mind using it again, but I think I would change out like the protein to be something different and then add more greens. Okay, so let me wrap up this video because there's 2 books left. So again, talking about The Eyes Are the Best Part. I mean, I basically summarized what the book is about. The main girl is going through it with her overbearing mother, but then the obnoxious new boyfriend on top of that. Like, he is so cartoonish in the way that he's like constantly praising authentic Chinese restaurants. Meanwhile, you go there and all he eats is like sweet and sour chicken. He acts super condescending towards the daughters. He will ogle other Asian women in public, but like the mom puts up with it because you know how Asian mothers be. So the main girl just gets increasingly angry and disgusted over time, and I can see how people would like it because it's almost like an outlet to see this girl go super unhinged and basically be like Hannibal. If anything, she's more relatable because she's college age, she's lower middle class, and she's a Korean American girl. I would say that the book doesn't really pick up until like the last 30% of it when shit is really going down, but up until that point, it's a lot of like building up to that moment. But ultimately, she gaslit, she gatekept, and she girl boss. And damn, did she eat that man's eyeballs. And honestly, good for her. Now with that in mind, I should probably take my medication before I also do something similar. I think a lot of people like this because it is such a vibe. I feel like personally, I would have wanted more understanding for how this normal Asian girl can suddenly be homicidal by the end of the book. Like, I would have wanted more of an explanation for that. But hey, that's just me. Like, you know, sometimes you want to kill a man and maybe you don't really need a build up into being ready to commit straight up murder and cannibalism. Like, maybe you can just fucking do it. But I think when I'm reading a book, that's more of like what I want. Like, I want the motivations in their psyche to be built higher and higher as we go through, so that I feel like, oh yeah, I can totally understand why this young girl is able to pull this off. I also wish that there was more twists and turns, because again, just for me saying the general summary of the book, you know what's gonna happen. You know it from the title, you know it from the way that it's set up. So I wish something had happened that would have me clutching my pearls and being like, but it was very straightforward from point A to point B. But hey, maybe that's what people want in a book. I think it would have worked better as like a novella rather than a novel. And I definitely think I would enjoy it better if I was watching it as a short film while I was high. Okay, so the last book that I will cover for this video is The Husbands. This is a very quirky book. It follows this woman who comes home one day to a husband and she's like, the fuck? I never married anybody, so who the hell are you? She finds out that he came from the attic, and it turns out that every time a husband goes back to the attic, a new one will come back downstairs to replace him. So throughout the book, you go through like so many different husbands that she's constantly swapping out. And ultimately it's about self-discovery, and also kind of like the question that I'm sure a lot of people wonder, where they think, oh, is this actually the right person? Or could there have been someone better out there? Now, if Victoria's watching this, I have never questioned that, but I know a lot of people do. Anyway, the book is very quirky because the tone of voice, especially from the main character's perspective, is like, this is kind of weird, but I guess I'll roll with it. So I read this because the concept is just so interesting and weird. But I do admit that when you read it after a while, it kind of becomes cyclical, because the same is happening. Like, every time she gets a new husband, she has to start over. And obviously there's going to be some kind of conclusion at the very end. But I think it was hard for me to like be super engaged throughout the entire journey. I found the pacing to be pretty slow, but I can still see people enjoying this because I do think the voice is charming. It is a unique concept. Maybe this is another story that would have worked better as a novella, just so that it doesn't feel too repetitive. But I think the philosophical points that you can get from a weird situation like that is interesting. And so that concludes my reading wrap-up. I am gonna finish eating the rest of my noodles. I feel like I'm gonna be force feeding myself so many times that I'm gonna get sick of it, but I know a lot of you like watching me cook and fail, so I hope that it was entertaining anyway. I will see you next time for the next video. Bye.